Hello, hello. I think we might be back on both platforms. For some reason, dual streaming was failing me, but I don't know if it's okay now. I hope so. Yeah. Let me just double check. Hello, everybody. Sorry about that. Okay. Hopefully, this is fine. Yeah. As I was just saying, I recently connected myself up to an Ethernet cable permanently, hoping that this kind of thing wouldn't happen. But I actually don't think it was the web because I was connected to Twitch. So I was wondering if they were enforcing some kind of anti-dual streaming policy or something, but who knows? All right. Corporation tax. In case you missed it, we're on corporation tax. So, despite this already huge incentive to raise capital using debt, the government takes the additional step of subsidizing corporations' interest expenses. Let's say the $80 million loan at 5% annual interest costs the company $4 million a year for 10 years. Let's say the corporation makes $100 million in revenue and has $80 million in costs for the year. The tax rate is 21%, but they can also count this $4 million per year as an expense. So instead of paying taxes on a $20 million profit, the corporation pays taxes on a $16 million profit. The amount they save on taxes is equal to the interest expense times the tax rate, meaning over the next 10 years, the corporation saves $8.4 million in taxes. This bias causes economic distortion by pushing businesses towards debt, not through debt's actual utility, but through tax relief. I mean, the debt interest deduction is just crazy. Oh, I haven't put the text on the screen, have I? But yeah, he's saying that the current corporate tax system incentivizes corporations to take on debt because their interest rates are deducted from the tax they pay. I tend to agree. Why are so many corporations so much in debt? That is one explanation. The corporate tax also taxes profits based on companies' location rather than the location of its products' consumption. This is part of the reason why companies move overseas and into tax havens. They want to avoid the corporate tax, and the easiest way to do that is to move your company's headquarter or intellectual property to a country with a lower or more favorable tax code. All of the company's actual operations and sales don't need to change, so many companies make the choice to relocate at the detriment of the domestic government's tax base and social investment. The final issue, especially relevant to the concerns of the left with the corporate tax, is that it taxes normal returns. When corporations tally all investments, costs, and revenues at the end of the year, they see the size of their profit. In a competitive market, a well-run corporation expects a normal return. This return is often very low as competitive markets compress profit margins. However, corporations often have market power from things like patents, land rent, brand equity, etc. These returns are supernormal returns. The return is supernormal because it implies a return from market power and or unproductive activity alone, and not a return from productive competitive process. So, yeah. Such investment is not immediately deductible through depreciation schedules, causing corporations to pay higher taxes and taxing normal returns. Workers and consumers, since investment, sorry. Yeah, okay. Taxing normal returns reduces the pool of investment dollars, so corporations don't invest as much into innovative, productivity enhancing things like factories and labs, so employment and wages fall, while consumer prices rise. Whether on the left or right, Corporations using money for productive investments is positive. It's the supernormal returns the tax code should target, since this return isn't from competitive or productive activity. This is return from market power alone. Doesn't the assumption there seem to be that like normal activity isn't taxed in the first instance, which I think it is? It is taxed in the first instance, right? Like, working is taxed even though it's like normal. The left shouldn't be in favor of a tax policy that reduces workers' wages or raises consumers' prices. And for what? After these accumulated distortions, the corporate income tax only raises a few $100 billion per year. There's a more efficient and progressive way to do things. So I understand that he's going through the theory, and I agree with some of his points about deductions. I'm quite sympathetic to the anti-corporate tax point of view, but there's no evidence. He hasn't reviewed the evidence on how the size of these effects. People call it the incidence of a tax. Who really pays it, right? Because there's the legal incidence, as in like it's taxed on corporations or it's taxed on employees' income, earnings. But then there's like who actually pays, because everything affects everything else, and people will, corporations might pay employees less if they're taxed more, or their profits might fall, or they might increase prices, so there's all these different possibilities, and this is what Econoboi is pointing to, but there's a lot of evidence on this. There's a lot of empirical evidence, and I just wonder what it actually says, because my understanding of it is that it does say the effects that he's talking about are there. Yeah, the investment is kind of a contestable category, isn't it, Clara? Because you could call a lot of what you do as a worker, a lot of the things you buy, maybe not all of them, but quite a few things, and the lower your income, the higher the proportion of income it will be. You could call them investment. Food, clothes, sleep. Anyway, the destination-based cash flow tax, or DBCFT, that almost looks like the alphabet, is a favourite of the most tax-wonky people I know, and for good reason. It addresses many of the problems with the corporate tax while having unique upsides. The DBCFT has a few... Whoa, what the fuck? You guys can't... Am I still there? Mate, my Streamlabs keeps sketching out recently, I swear to God. I'd pay them like some money for the subscription. I mean, it's tax deductible because it's investment, but it just keeps sketching out and it wasn't working. The dual streaming wasn't working. I'm live on Twitch. This is, let me just check it hasn't cut out on YouTube. Live. Okay, good. Sorry. Now I'm in a state of fear, Anyway. The DBCFT has a few key components. Corporations deduct the full value of investments immediately when incurred. Corporations pay taxes on imports and no taxes on exports. Corporations can't deduct interest from debt on their taxes. Allowing the full deductibility of investment ensures the great portion of remaining profit is a supernormal return, enabling optimal invest levels. This might look like a company buying extra equipment that increases worker productivity, wages, and employment while lowering prices for consumers. Another structure of the DBCFT is trade neutrality. Not only are investments fully deductible, but the value of exports is deductible as well. Any revenue earned from selling to international buyers is not taxed. No taxes on exports, sorry, yeah. Just double checking that was the right way around. The rationale for this is twofold. American-made products, often already face taxation from other countries, and taxing only domestic sales means a corporation's headquarters location is irrelevant to the taxes it owes. So right now, is he saying that companies use their high exports to specific countries as an excuse to pay lower tax? No, he's not saying that. Sorry, it's a bit more subtle than that. Yeah. You can change. When it says taxing only domestic sales, but your headquarter location will affect what counts as a domestic sale, will it not? Corporations pay taxes on imports and no taxes on exports. So it doesn't matter where you sell them. Then why does it say taxing only domestic sales? I think I get the point. It's like, yeah, it doesn't matter where you sell them, but I don't know. Maybe it's just the wording. The DBCFT also taxes all imports, as in, when a company imports something from abroad, this is not an expense for tax purposes, so the company pays whatever the DBCFT rate is. The export exemption and the import taxation are what make the DBCFT destination-based. Companies pay tax based on where items are actually consumed and not where profits are headquartered. The anti-protectionists of the world might shout, but that's no different than a tariff. Why in tarnation would we support such a thing? The DBCT is industry and product neutral since the tax rate applies to all imports. The DBCFT is also trade neutral, i.e. it subsidizes exports and taxes imports at the same rate, so it doesn't change trade decisions. When imports are taxed, domestically, there is less demand for foreign products, which lowers the demand for foreign currency since US dollars are now exchanged less for foreign currency. This, in turn, strengthens the dollar. The strengthened dollar helps buyers import foreign products, offsetting some of the depressed demand from the import tax. I mean, maybe, okay. So this is like, it's fine, right? I like these ideas, and his economic logic is obviously, reasonable, but there's no evidence here. These are all theoretical links, There are similar effects with the export exemption. US exports, or I should say hypothetical links. Hypothetical and theoretical. US exports become more competitive, causing demand for US dollars to increase as foreign buyers want more US products, but the stronger dollar makes it more expensive for foreign buyers to purchase US products. Together, these effects offset much of the allocative inefficiencies with tariffs. The DBCFT structure also disincentivizes profit shifting and punishes tax havens. Corporations go through great lengths to shift their corporate and reporting structures to avoid corporate taxes. This is bad for domestic citizens losing out on socially valuable tax revenue, and it creates toxic international dynamics. For instance, a country like Ireland prefers the clunky, suboptimal status quo because corporations flock to its country to avoid international taxation. Ireland helps companies shield supernormal returns to the detriment of citizens in every other country. under a DBCFT, if a company shifts profits or production to a foreign country but sells its products in the US, it still pays tax on most of its revenue. By taxing products based on where they're consumed, the headquarter location or exact corporate structure of a business becomes irrelevant to the tax code, resulting in better outcomes for society and the economy. This is an international thing though, right? I think one reason I was getting a little bit confused is that I wasn't sure if he was saying this is like from the point of view of the US or from the world as a whole. If you've got an international thing, then you're because it's taxation based on imports, isn't it? So you're taxing where goods are imported to, or if they're sold domestically, right? Is that right? Pay taxes on imports and those. So it's domestic consumption, but it sort of requires other countries to do something similar. Ireland can't do that anymore. Double Dutch sandwich doesn't exist anymore. The DBCFT also ends the deduction of interest from taxes. This eliminates a subsidy on debt, reducing corporations' debt bias. As discussed above, this bias will remain as equity owners don't like inviting outside investors if they can avoid splitting profits. However, eliminating the tax code bias on top of this results in more optimal capital structuring and allocation. So, I do just want to say that corporations can't deduct interest from debt on their taxes. I don't feel like that's an intrinsic part of this destination-based cash flow, as in you could end the interest debt deduction with debt interest deduction is how people say it, isn't it? From just by itself. You could also potentially incorporate the deduction. I feel like this is, yeah. I mean, maybe it is just a modification of corporation tax. Alright, we understand the problems with the corporate tax and how a DBCFT solves them. Does this result in more revenue raised? Do rich corporations pay their fair share under a DBCFT? Does this tax really belong in a leftist policy platform? The DBCFT has several positive distributional outcomes. 1. Full expensing causes corporations to invest more in productivity, innovation, and employment-enhancing ventures. 2. Taxing the corporate interest payments strips money away from wealthy lenders. And 3. The destination basis raises much more revenue by taxing a larger base of consumption, imports. All three of these things make a DBCFT more progressive than the current corporate income tax. The DBCFT represents a smart and progressive tax policy for the future, and its placement on the leftist platform makes sense. And leftists can still talk about raising taxes on corporations, which the DBCFT does, and the same leftists can talk about the efficiency gains of DBCFT relative to current policy, and I hope the DBCFT makes it into more leftist policy spaces in the future. What's it stand for? Destination-based cash flow tax. I do like some of the ideas here. Obviously, the debt interest reduction is crazy. And the imports thing, taxes on imports and no taxes on exports, that seems to be a way to prevent like tax avoidance. But I don't know. Well, the supernormal return, you deduct the full value of investments immediately when incurred. I agree that I don't know if it targets that. The great portion of remaining profit as a supernormal return Enabling optimal investment levels. As opposed to not deducting it, right? Where and why? So I'm not clear on the ratios here. If you didn't deduct it, you would get lower investment for sure. If you don't deduct investment, you'll get lower investment. But you can imagine a situation with low investment where supernormal returns are quite high. Say you've got like a sort of Schumpeterian, very stagnant late stage company. I forget what exactly his term was for them. But do you remember Joseph Schumpeter, the economist who was like, companies eventually become very, very, morbid and stagnant. If you imagine a company like that, then they're making loads of profit without much investment, and their returns are still super. I'm just not. Yeah, it's fine. I think it's clearer to say you're encouraging investment rather than just saying that it changes the supernormal normal ratio, because I don't think encouraging investment means you change that. I think they're two different things. I don't know. Let's say Facebook invests in internet infrastructure to increase penetration. This is possible only because of FB's size. Any returns due to this would be supernormal in my opinion, but we would be untouched by DBCFT. Yeah, exactly. Right, yeah. So you can invest, you can exploit. So, but it works both ways, right? This is why I don't think it even has an impact on this. What I said is true of the stagnant company, but you're talking about the opposite, where you exploit your position in order to invest to make loads of money, and that's a supernormal profit. But then maybe he's not saying that supernormal profits would fall. The great portion of the remaining profit is supernormal return. Enabling optimal investment. But they're not optimal investment levels if you're exploiting your market position, which is what you're talking about, like Root Titan X. I feel like there's like maybe three different moving parts in that point about supernormal stuff. I don't think you can reduce supernormal returns without directly attacking monopolies, without direct antitrust, pro-competition legislation. I think you just need to do that. Slightly over. I don't. So a lot of people talk about just taxing corporations based on the sales destination. But he only talks about taxes and he only talks about imports. But he seems to be, I feel like he's assuming that you would tax domestic sales based on domestic sales. But couldn't you just get like all of the sales of a corporation and say the relative ratios of corporate tax that you own depend on the tax rate in that country times the amount you've spent in that country, you've sold in that country? He thinks that the taxed portion is going to tend to zero. Maybe. Does Google even sell anything? Well, no. I don't know. Here's a comment. I had encountered the claim that it had a large hidden flaw. It was claimed that if a country replaced its corporate income tax with a DBCFT, from the perspective of foreign companies, it would have a corporate income tax of 0%. This would encourage multinational companies to shift profits into that country which had just introduced a DBCFT. Yeah. Then other countries would be forced to retaliate to prevent such profit shifting or adopt a DBCFT themselves, greatly destabilizing the international economic system. That would... Right, so that kind of relates to what I was saying about it needs to be international, because the export-import dynamics are very... I don't know, I feel like you can do better than that with corporate tax. Like, destination, but like, yes, I've heard loads of tax economists say, I've heard loads of them say that you should tax corporations based on their sales, locations, rather than where their profits are reported. They sell ad space, but does that count as investment? This is the thing, it's like a lot of companies just don't really do something that you would regard as like these major tech companies, the ones that everyone hates. They're not like normal companies, are they? They don't like produce something and sell it. They're doing a bunch of other stuff that I think you need like antitrust legislation to combat. I mean, not that Econoboi is claiming this is going to solve all of the world's problems, to be fair. But he does seem to be slightly overclaiming. Landlords. Jeez. Popularity deductions. Right, let's talk about land tax then. So I agree with Econoboi's diagnosis of the situation with corporate tax. There are lots of weird exemptions that are bad. There can be an effect on workers and consumers instead of like taxing the rich, right, with corporate tax. There is a problem with how profits are counted, where they're located, the debt interest deduction. You know, there's loads of wacky stuff, but that specific proposal, the DFCT or whatever it was called, let me just say it one more time so I actually remember it. The destination-based cash flow tax, the DBCFT. It seemed weird. It seemed like it was focused on imports and exports, and then like investment deductions, and the tax, the interest rate thing was just sort of tacked on. There's better ways of achieving what he wants. What I was actually interested in is whether he wants a lower corporation tax as well, which he didn't really go into. I thought that was going to be the controversial part. All right. Land tax. Georgists. Start your engines. Following from part 2, today we tackle landlords. Much like the capitalist who earns money from his money rather than from his labour, the landlord does much the same, earning both rent from land and ire from the left. That's a good turn of phrase. Not only do landlords earn money from unproductive activity, owning land, they do so at the direct exclusion of others. And the kicker is, no one can take credit for creating land. Land rent, the money derived from land itself, is by definition unearned and/or the result of speculation. It's important to distinguish between rent and productive activity. For example, a farmer earns money from his land by planting crops, harvesting, and selling them. However, the farmer also earns land rent, i.e. the value of happening to own a specific plot of land, separate from its productive use. A more intuitive example is real estate. Take a walk through a typical Zillow listing in the San Francisco area, and you'll find $1 million houses for sale that are either run down or less than 1,200 square feet. This isn't because the reasonable cost to build such a house is over $1 million. Rather, this is because of the land's location. Demand to live in San Francisco is so high that people are willing to pay a lot for the location, and current residents benefit from this demand, whether they actively contributed to it or just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Royalties from landed resources or rent payments to landlords fall in the same bucket. This is income, not from services provided or entrepreneurial activities, but rather from luck, circumstance, and/or speculation. At best, land rents come from unproductive activity, and at worst, land rents result in suboptimal economic and social outcomes. For example, someone refusing to develop land due to their desire to speculate on land value resulting in a housing shortage. There's a simple solution to this problem, and it's compatible with other leftist goals like public ownership and/or decommodification. The land value tax is a tax on the assessed value of land. Let's say a local government determines a plot of land is worth $20,000 and the LVT rate is 10%. That year, the owner owes $2,000 in taxes. This tax is perhaps the most widely favoured in the history of modern economic discourse. The city of Detroit proposed a land value tax a year or so ago, and economists were asked about the potential of a land value tax to enhance the incentives for owners to develop their land and thereby give a substantial boost to local economic growth. Even the single person who disagreed recognized the value of taxing land. He just wasn't sure about using the word substantial to describe its benefits for Detroit. So they all agree, basically. Fair amount of uncertain, one disagree. Oh, my meme. My meme was gone. Ah. So why the land value tax? What makes it good? And why should the left include it in their policy platform? I'll make 3 main points about the LVT. 1. The LVT is productivity and growth enhancing. 2. The LVT raises a lot of money. 3. The LVT significantly reduces inequality. Oh, he likes making 3 points, doesn't he? Productivity and growth. Most cities tax property, which taxes both land and the improvements value on top of the land. This causes lower levels of investment, something the left shouldn't support. The tax code shouldn't punish, for example, a landowner building hundreds of affordable units on top of their land. Cities, sometimes recognizing this problem, will split a property's valuation into its land and improvements, allowing the city to charge a different rate for each. Doing this, cities see increased building and a higher density. Was this the Pittsburgh one? Come on, baby. Pennsylvania, yeah. The Pittsburgh one, yeah. Journal of Urban Economics. Urban sprawl has become a policy concern of national prominence. One tool that has been suggested for combating sprawl is the land or split rate tax. In theory, such taxes can raise the ratio of housing capital to land. This in turn can raise the density of housing units where it is applied, if the average size of housing units does not increase enough to offset an effect on the number of housing units. This research explores these issues, looking at a panel of land uses and demographics in Pennsylvania. We confirmed the theoretical prediction that the split rate tax raises the capital land ratio. We also find that the primary effect is in more housing units rather than bigger units, suggesting the split rate tax is potentially a powerful anti-sprawl tool. We find adoption of the split rate tax increases the number of housing units and that these units follow a more dense pattern of development. Okay. Increased building and higher density from taxes. 3 points thing is one of the AI markers, is it? I feel like he didn't use AI, but maybe he did. He could have used AI. Doing this, cities see... Oh, sorry. Yeah. Increased development, increased density, blah, blah, blah. And the best part of a land value tax is that it has limited deadweight loss. There's an old saying, if you want less of something, tax it. This is because most taxes, to some degree, disincentivize the taxed activity, whether it's labour income, capital income, wealth accumulation, consumption, etc. This effect is overblown by some, but it's real, however marginal. Unlike the things mentioned above, taxes don't destroy land to any degree. This is a key reason why economists rank the land value tax so high relative to other forms of taxation. Society gets a pro-social tax policy in exchange for very little or no deadweight loss, and that's before we do anything with the revenue. It's one of the AI markers because people talk like that a lot in articles. I mean, yeah, that's true. Chicken and egg problem here. Speaking of revenue, the LVT can raise a lot of it. Every locality and countries at large have land. The United States has a lot of it. Lars Doucette, we don't have a lot of it in the UK. I just want that to be known. Lars Doucette, George's extraordinaire, provides perhaps the most robust survey of the literature and analysis on how much an LVT could raise. He goes through various valuation methodologies, concluding that a guy named Smith's estimates are most reasonable. Then applies two different LVT rates, 5% and 8%, to see how much revenue they could raise in 2019. Trillions. Okay. Lars charts this compared to other large buckets of federal spending, along with a more conservative valuation methodology from the Fed as a lower bound. Charting these revenues as a percentage of 2019's nominal GDP, we see the following. Lars Doucette. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs, bestowing life. Cool. Okay. LVT / Christianity, whatever. It's the combination we've all been waiting for. Land rents, as a percentage, 5%, 8%, 9%. We can take these percentages and apply them to 2024's GDP. I take 29 trillion to be conservative to get a basic, though not robust, idea of the potential revenue an LVT could raise today. The federal budget deficit in 2024 was 1.8 trillion. This means on the lower bound, an LVT could almost eliminate the budget deficit. At most, it could eliminate the budget deficit and provide tax revenue worth $8,000 per American on top. An expansion of social spending to this degree has the potential to greatly reduce poverty and inequality, all while boosting economic growth and productivity without resulting in deadweight loss or negative distortions. Let's keep going. The land value tax is a type of wealth tax. It is, after all, a tax on the value of a particular type of wealth, in this case, land. The best justification for a wealth tax is its potential to reduce wealth inequality, but a general wealth tax comes with a lot of complications and potential downsides, like reduced investment. The land value tax increases investment and targets a large portion of wealth directly. It's difficult to find the distribution of land ownership, but real estate as a proxy, tracked by the Fed, is very unequally distributed. So the top 1% in the darker blue own about 10%. Well, they own about the same as the bottom 50%. Top 1% about the same as the bottom 50%. And the sort of middle class own about half of real estate. And the rich own about, under a third. The top 1% own more real estate than the bottom 50%. Oh yeah, that's true today. Yeah. This shouldn't come as a surprise since all categories of wealth are unequally distributed. Land is no different. Is this the... Sorry. By wealth percentile. Oh, wealth percentile. All right, okay. So that is share of... I mean, it's partly... So this is partly tautological. But there are, of course, other forms of wealth. There's also evidence to suggest that housing ownership represents a significant share of a capital income. So the land value tax, by socialising land rents, captures progressive revenue for the state and, in part, solves a major driver of inequality, housing affordability, by incentivising additional building. On balance, a general wealth tax might remain a good idea, but the lowest hanging wealth tax available is the land value tax. About 18% of the assets owned by the top 10% is real estate. And in addition to the land value tax, there are better ways to tackle wealth inequality than a general wealth tax, which I will discuss in later articles. I'm far from the first person to speak about the importance of a land value tax. The land value tax could go on any platform from left to right, since it's not incompatible with a leftist disposition on housing and land. A leftist could support a great expansion of public housing and public ownership of resources while still supporting a land value tax on any remaining private ownership. The land value tax has its hurdles. The Constitution arguably does not allow a land value tax at the federal level, and all advocates have the burden of explaining how land valuation could work. Luckily, the land value tax is often legal at the local and state level, where governments already have systems to value properties. So the advocacy chain seems clear. Say the community should value improvements and land separately, lower the rate on improvements while raising the rate on land until the improvement rate goes to 0%. The LVT is in effect a fee to hold land, making pure land speculation and unproductive activity costly. No longer can someone sit on a valuable piece of land for free, incentivizing them to use the land for some productive purpose, like housing or industrial development. Those on the left have several reasons to advocate for a land tax, all else equal. It increases growth while reducing speculation. It raises a lot of revenue, mostly from the wealthy, and it reduces inequality. It is one of the very few win-win-win economic policies, and the left should back it with full force. Sure. So I think most people listening, maybe not everybody, will be familiar with these arguments about land tax, right? And it is definitely one of the better individual policies out there. My issue is this. Everybody is always like, oh, it can't be passed on to tenants or anything. And you're not going to see it in house prices. And I understand that you might, because it reduces speculation by taxing people who are holding it, I understand that there could be a beneficial effect for prices there, and therefore rents, by implication. But suppose my landlord is just paying more tax. Am I really confident that he's not going to charge me more rent? But when people say it can't be passed to tenants, that seems like a very strong claim. That's like a very theoretical claim. So there was a conversation I had with somebody about this who is an expert in tax law, and they basically said that in some instances where land taxes are introduced, they end up actually being paid in a very, very similar way to existing property taxes. So economists have all these very clean theoretical distinctions between you've got a tax on capital, you've got a tax on land, you've got a tax on the property, you've got versus a tax on land. And they're like, well, theoretically, you can't pass it on with the land because the supply of land is fixed. And it's like, okay, that's a theoretical result, except if your implementation of the taxes is quite similar due to practical considerations about how you actually design and enforce taxes, if a given landlord, property owner, freehold owner, does not really distinguish between the property tax and the land tax, why are we so confident that one will be passed on but not the other? I think this is where we need some law and economics. I mean, more building is one. Can LVT be passed on to tenants? I think I agree that it would reduce speculation and that it would increase building. So therefore, there could be beneficial effects on this is Lars Doucette. Many critics are skeptical because just about every other tax in the world is passed on. Why should LVT be so special? Let's explain this theoretical model. Okay, this looks interesting. Yeah. I keep moving around on my chair, writhing. Imagine I'm a landlord and I have a vacant lot I'm renting to a tenant who's got a mobile home park there. What's going to happen if a land value tax is imposed on me? Well, I'm already charging as much as the market will bear. If I charge any more, my tenant will move out. But what? Well, maybe they won't move out though. What have you got market power? Okay, but why shouldn't I be able to pass on the tax to the tenant? If you tax gasoline or cigarettes, the price goes up and are ultimately borne by the customer. Why should land be any different? The difference is that the supply of gasoline and cigarettes fluctuates because you can produce more or less of them. When you put a tax on gasoline or cigarettes of even a few cents, somewhere in the economy there is a marginal oil well or a marginal tobacco farm whose profit margin was the same as or less than the tax. Now their profit is entirely wiped out. So what's the point of producing anymore? Price signals from the market are telling them to stop producing and doing something else. And price is ultimately driven by supply and demand, not the wishes of a seller. Even a dedicated cartel like OPEC can't enforce high oil prices by fiat. They do it by cutting off production and driving down the global supply of oil until people are forced to pay the price OPEC wants. But he does seem to be assuming like a kind of perfect market here, because land is a local monopoly, right? So you've got at best imperfect competition. It might be that competition is relatively insulated, and therefore supply effects aren't really that relevant in the first place. And going back to what I said earlier about he's going to move out. What if the tenant doesn't move out? What if he can't move out? This is what I'm talking about. Anyway, let's keep going because there's evidence too. Okay, let's go back to land. How do land value taxes drive down land prices? The important thing to keep in mind is that land value purchase price is a stock, but land income rent is a flow. The amount of water flowing out of my tap is a flow. The amount of water currently sitting in my bathtub is a stock. The key thing that land income drives land price and not the other way around. If a property is capable of generating $10,000 a year in rents, then the amount I'm willing to pay to buy is 10,000 times X, where X represents how many years I'm willing to wait to break even on my investment. Okay. That makes sense. So how does an LVT affect the price of land? Using the bathtub metaphor again, let's put a valve under the tap so half of the water goes into the tub and half goes somewhere else. The amount of water flowing out of the tap does not change. The land is productive as it ever was. However, the amount of water collected in my bathtub does change. 5 minutes of flow will produce less water in the tub than before. If I'm trying to sell my land to someone, they're going to notice the tax and correctly calculated that it will earn them half as much income over X years, so they'll happily pay half as much for it. Okay, I find that more convincing than the other thing. because land is based on present discounted value, and therefore the tax reduces the present discounted value, reduces the value of the financial asset. Therefore, you could actually imagine prices going down. Okay, that's the theoretical link that I needed to be crystallized in my head there. Interesting, though, could apply to other assets to some degree, because I think this is a matter of degrees. And what about rental price? The rental price comes directly from the flow. The land is in demand because of its inherent productivity. Someone who occupies that land can generate a certain amount of wealth each month. Without a land value tax, the owner of that land can charge rent up to the difference between their land's productivity and the best freely available alternative, establishing the margin of productivity. This means that as productivity rises, so does the rent. This phenomenon is known as Ricardo's law of rent. With a land value tax, the owner has to pay that tax every month whether they have a tenant or not. They're already charging the highest amount the market will bear, and as we've already shown, they are unable to change the supply of land. All the leverage is on the side of the tenants, which forces the landlord to eat the tax. The price to buy the land goes down, and the price for a tenant to rent it goes down. But the total amount of income the land itself produces, land rent, stays the same. A portion of it is just being collected by the taxing agency. That's the theory, at least. Does it hold up in real life? According to the evidence, the answer is yes. Okay, this is interesting, because I haven't seen this Danish paper. If the tenants can't move out, the landlord would have charged them higher already. The tax doesn't change that. I mean, maybe in like a sort of seamless world, right? But I feel like this reminds me a little bit of the debate over what the fuck was it called? Seller's inflation or greedflation, where people were like, well, why didn't the corporations raise taxes before? And it's like, because they didn't have like a justification for it. This is my big issue with some varieties of Georgism, and I stress that this is against a backdrop of supporting a land value tax for sure, and agreeing with a lot of their analysis. My big issue with a lot of it is that it's very like bare bones neoclassical. A lot of the reasoning is very like demand supply diagrams, like perfect competition. If you scratch beneath the surface, you find that. And I just think that in reality, if you get into the legal, logistical, information aspects of this problem, you end up with like, well, what they're saying has some truth, but there are other considerations. And it may not be the case that like the tax is passed perfectly onto tenants. But let's look at the evidence anyway. Imagine a hypothetical country with a decent property assessment scheme already in place. Land and improvements are assessed separately to an objective and equalised standard, and each is taxed at a separate rate. Let's further say that this country's assessments are widely considered to be fair and well tested against market values. As a starting condition, each of the counties in this country has its own independent land tax rate. Then, for our experimental intervention, we'll have all of the countries raise or lower the tax on land values randomly within a predefined range all at the same time. Then we'll observe what happens to land prices. Unfortunately for us, countries with the necessary prerequisite assessment policy are few and far between, and sovereign states don't typically run randomly controlled economic experiments on their population, so I'm afraid, wait, something almost exactly like this happened in Denmark in 2007. What happened in Denmark was an accident, but you'd be hard-pressed to design a better experimental setup if you tried. A 2017 working paper by Høj, Jorgensen and Schou, entitled Land Taxes and Housing Prices, published at the Danish Secretariat of Economic Councils, has the full story. An interesting side note about Denmark is that they have like a very well-developed economic scene that a lot of people outside of the country, and especially outside of that area, like outside of the Scandinavian countries, Nordic countries, maybe Germany, like some of Northern Europe, some of the rest of Northern Europe. They just won't know about them. It's like very, very parochial, I suppose, Danish economics. And they often produce work for the government, right? So yeah, the Danish Secretariat of Economic Councils. But it's not in like the top American-led economics journals. One day, Denmark decided to redraw all its municipal boundaries. Regions that had been under one local government woke up the next day under a different one, immediately adopting a new set of local regulations and rules, including changed tax rates. This caused a large-scale, semi-random shuffling of land value tax rates overnight. That is literally like, I bet there must be so many papers written about this, because it caused so much shuffling of loads of stuff. Other taxes, regulations, whatever policies. Minimum wage? Crucially, tax assessment policy was pretty much uniform throughout the country. The only thing this shake-up changed with regard to land policy was the actual individual rates of tax on land set by the local governments. This gives us a nice big N of 250 individual areas, each with a clear before and after change in land tax rate. All of these changes came into being at exactly the same time from a single swift outside intervention, and the overall change in aggregate tax rate was close to zero. Average change in land tax rates in there. Right, okay. Overall in the country, about a zero change in tax rates. Some saw an increase, some saw a decrease, some were unchanged. Netting out at about this is a very Scandinavian thing to do. Just randomly rejig. Somebody was talking about the United States of, well, not Scandinavia, the United Nordic States. They should just, Finland, Iceland, Denmark, Sweden, Norway should just unite, have their own defense policy, good against Russia and probably the USA. I think it's a really good idea. I know I don't live in any of those countries, but I'm into it. Anyway, don't want to get distracted. The most important thing to note is that this paper claims to get around the endogeneity problem. For those of you who aren't researchers, an endogenous factor is something that originates from inside of the system you're studying, whereas an exogenous factor is something that originates from outside of it. The endogeneity problem is a particularly annoying gremlin that makes it hard to study economics empirically. You can never be sure the effects you're measuring were actually caused by the intervention you're studying. Everything's a big bowl of soup, and it's hard to untangle what causes what. Here's an example. Let's say I'm the sovereign emperor of planet Lars. Among my many powers and privileges is the sole right to set the prime interest rate for the entire Lartian economy. One fine Tuesday, I stroll into my throne room and pull the gilded lever that changes the rate from 1.5 to 1.2%. PhD students rejoice. What a great natural experiment for measuring the effects of changes to the prime interest rate. Well, except for the pesky fact that the sovereign emperors of planets named after themselves don't tend to just pull the prime interest rate lever for no reason. Maybe I pulled it because the economy was slowing down, or to distract everyone from the unpopular war against the Earthlings I'm currently losing. Were those effects the PhD students observed after I pulled the lever actually caused by me lowering the prime interest rate, or were they caused by the very force that drove me to pull the lever in the first place? What researchers really like to see is an exogenous effect, something that unambiguously comes from outside the system. Going back to planet Lars, one day a ghostly hyperspace beast shows up, instantly eats every car on the entire planet that has a manual transmission, then vanishes in a puff of purple smoke. There's no way this had anything to do with the mysterious epicycles within the Lartian economy. It was a pure exogenous shock, and we can be confident that any subsequent observed changes in the economy had something to do with the beast's insatiable appetite for stick shifts, especially if the beast was kind enough to leave a few randomly selected areas untouched as a control group. Hose, Jorgensen and Shu claim the Danish study is the first study of land value tax to enjoy such a clear exogenous trigger. The method used in the present study is inspired by, not going to say that, who studied capitalization of Norwegian property taxes during 1995-97. They also find evidence of complete capitalization. As the authors note themselves, however, examining the relationship between tax rate and house price changes may generally result in endogeneity problems, which they try to avoid using various instrumental variables. The present study is immune to this problem because the Danish local government reform of 2007 exogenously imposes the tax rate changes. Backing up the exogenous claim is that although the change came from Danish government, it had nothing to do with tax policy. They were just reorganizing the municipal map, and the changes in tax rates were simply the result of whatever jurisdiction your area found itself belonging to the next day. As a quick example, if an area raised land taxes because they needed more money, the fact that the area needed more money could be just as plausible a cause for any observed changes as the change to the land value tax rate. But if you change everyone's land taxes overnight in semi-random directions with no particular regard for the local economic or political situation, you can be more confident that subsequent changes you observe do in fact stem from that intervention. The authors measure the before and after changes, apply a bunch of econometric tests, run it with and without controls just to be sure, and conclude that a land value tax is fully capitalized into the price of the property itself. Fully capitalized is a fancy way of saying the price of land goes down proportionately to how much land income is taxed away. The results demonstrate a clear effect on sales prices of the observed changes in land tax rates. Furthermore, the magnitude of the changes implies full capitalization of the present value of the change in future tax payments for a discount rate of 2.3%, which is within the range of reasonable discount rates for households during the period in question. The analysis consequently supports the hypothesis that perceived permanent land tax changes should be capitalized fully into the price of land and property. This just means that if you tax land, absent any other interventions, the price of land goes down. The rental income of the land available to the landlord goes down too, which means the landlord is eating the tax and can't pass it on to the tenant. If the landlord could successfully pass on the tax, we wouldn't see a decrease in the price of land that amounts to full capitalization. Okay. This is quite convincing. I won't read this whole thing, but yeah, this is quite convincing. I might get back to it another time. He reviews a bunch of other studies, 5 other studies, other supporting tests. There's one that's against. I guess he takes it apart. So I did actually read this guy's book review of Progress and Poverty. I think I've read parts of this series before. That was quite convincing. I'll give him that. I think the fact that the tax is incorporated into the value of land necessarily, because land as an asset is valued with tax. With tax included, that makes sense, and that Danish evidence is very convincing. I'll give it that. I still do think that various there are complications around, geography and competition and information that might mean that it's not always like a full capitalization, but it's also a matter of degree. Certainly the land tax is your best bet of a tax that's not going to be passed on to people. I'll give it that. I need to review these a bit more. I didn't want to get into land tax too much. Yeah. That was good. Yeah, I need to read that whole, or reread that whole series. Actually, this is good. Let me link it in. I think somebody already linked it in. But that whole series, where he first reviews Progress and Poverty by Henry George, the original Georgist text, obviously, hence the name. then he goes into like that sort of the history of thought, then the theory, then some of the specifics, empirics, the practicalities. So I had read this guy before, but I didn't know his name, but I feel like I remember his name now. All right, that's enough for today. I might come back later this week. I think because I might on Friday I might just stream instead of a gaming stream. I might just do the rest of Econoboi's things because I've done 3 of them now, and there's 6. And it's like I need to fucking eat and shit like that. And everyone's probably going to get an eyes glaze over. It'd be better for us to do this, to revisit this on Friday. But really interesting, yeah. Land tax is better than I thought. Corporation tax is about what I thought. Was unconvinced there on that specific proposal. Expenditure tax, don't know. Not sure. Haven't made up my mind. But maybe I will. Who knows if I will. Okay, thanks. Hey, you guys, hey, you should start an empire. You need protection against Russia and America. It's for your own good. I'm going to call it Britanavia.